Dirt does not lie. That was the thing Rael Donner had always believed. People lied. Records lied. Governors lied with smiles and pressed collars and clean hands. But dirt was honest. Dirt just sat there and held what you put into it. He had been coming to this canyon for 3 years. Every time, he brought nothing. No flowers. No food. No ritual. He just came, stood, and looked at the stone marker his own hands had set into the ground. It read, Near a Donner, Salvager. Honest man Rael had chosen those last 2 words himself. At the time he believed them completely. Now he was not so sure about the honest part. Not because his father had lied to him, but because Rael suspected his father had known something enormous and chosen to carry it quietly, alone, the way all Donner men seemed to carry things. The canyon was dry and pale in the late afternoon light. Wind moved through it in low, slow circles, stirring up fine dust that tasted like chalk. Rael crouched near the marker and began pulling away the wind-blown debris, dead scrub, small stones, a tangle of dried fiber weed that had wrapped itself around the base of the marker like it was trying to claim the place. He worked without thinking. That was the point of coming here. To do something with his hands that required no thought and no decision. His fingers found the edge of something that was not soil. He stopped. He pressed down. The ground gave in a way that ground should not. Not soft like mud, more like something hollow beneath a thin crust. He pressed again, to the left of the marker this time. Same thing. He pulled out the small folding blade he kept clipped to his belt and probed the edge of it slowly. The crust cracked along a line that was too clean to be natural. Someone had cut this ground open before and sealed it back up. Recently enough that the repair had not fully settled. Rael sat back on his heels and looked at the stone marker for a moment. Then he dug. It did not take long. 2 hands depth, maybe 3. And there it was. Wrapped in layers of heat-treated mineral cloth, the dark, dense kind used to protect fragile cargo on long salvage runs, was an egg. Large. The size of 2 fists together. Its shell was pale gold with faint silver lines running through it like cracks in old porcelain. Except these lines did not look like damage. They looked like design. Like veins. Like something that had always been part of the structure. And it was warm. Not warm from the soil. Rael pressed his palm flat against the cloth and felt it immediately. A slow, deep warmth that pulsed faintly. Not mechanical. Not stored heat from a battery or a coil. Something else. Something that felt, if he was honest, like breathing. He sat there for a long time. He thought about reporting it. The colony had a wildlife registry. The Colonial Science Office had a protocol for unusual biological finds. Governor Solta's office had a hotline for exactly this kind of discovery, staffed by patient people who would take detailed notes and then make the find disappear into a filing system no one ever opened again. He thought about his father's hands, which had been large and careful and methodical. The kind of hands that wrapped things properly when they mattered. He thought about the mineral cloth, which was not cheap and was not something you buried by accident. He took the egg home. He told himself it was temporary. He would report it in the morning, once he had thought it through. That was reasonable. That was the kind of thing a careful man did. He drove back along the canyon road with the egg on the passenger seat, wrapped still in its cloth, and he did not look at it because he did not want to feel what he was already feeling. The feeling that his father had left it there for him specifically. The feeling that this had been waiting. Back at the homestead, he set it on the workbench in the back room where he kept his salvage tools. He cleared a space carefully, set it down, and stood looking at it under the yellow work light. The silver lines on the shell seemed slightly brighter in the artificial light. Or maybe that was just his eyes. He pulled a thermal blanket from the supply cabinet and folded it around the egg loosely. Not tight, just enough to hold the warmth in. Then he stood there for another moment, doing nothing. He went inside and made himself something to eat, and did not sleep well, and did not report anything in the morning. The egg was still warm when he checked it at first light. Warmer, maybe. Something inside it shifted when his hand touched the cloth. Rael stood very still. He had spent 3 years being afraid of the wrong things. He was beginning to understand that his father had known that too. 70 hours after Rael brought the egg home, the shell broke. He was in the next room when it happened. He heard it. Not a crack, but a sound like a deep inhale, like something drawing breath for the first time and the shell adjusting around it. He put down the wrench he was holding and walked to the doorway. The thermal blanket had shifted. One end of the egg was tilted upward, and a split ran along one of the silver lines from the base almost to the center. As Rail watched, the split widened. A small, scaled snout pushed through. Then a foreleg. Then a second. The creature inside worked at the shell with patience rather than panic, like it was solving a problem rather than escaping one. It took 40 minutes. What came out was small, about the length of his forearm, folded. Silver scales that caught the work light and held it. Patches of pale gold along the chest and the underside of the jaw. It shook itself once, scattering small fragments of shell, and then sat completely still and looked at him. Its eyes were amber, the kind of amber that had something trapped inside it. Rail sat down on the floor in front of the workbench. He did this because he did not want to tower over it. He did not think about why he did not want to tower over it. He just did it. The creature watched him sit. Then it stepped forward carefully on legs that were already steadier than they had any right to be. It walked to the edge of the workbench, looked down at the distance, and stepped off. It landed cleanly, walked to within a meter of Rail, and stopped. They looked at each other. "All right," Rail said again, because he did not have better words and it had worked adequately before. By the end of the first day, it was eating small strips of protein ration that Rail offered flat on his palm, feeling faintly ridiculous. By the end of the second day, it had investigated every corner of the back room, the kitchen, and the supply cabinet, and had settled on sleeping on top of the thermal blanket he had used for the egg. It slept in a tight coil with its tail wrapped over its nose. On the morning of the third day, Rail was sitting at the table with a cup of water, watching it watch him from across the room, when it said, "You are Rail." He spilled the water. It was not a hiss or a growl shaped into something language adjacent. It was clear colonial standard, spoken with the careful rhythm of someone choosing each word before releasing it. Rail set the cup down. His hands were steady. He was proud of that. "Yes," he said. "How do you know that?" "The egg knew," it said. "I know what the egg knew." Rail was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" It tilted its head. "Before I hatched, there were things inside the egg. Not memories like I would make. Older, like impressions, warmth, sound, words that were repeated many times. Your name was repeated many times. From outside, from someone who came to where the egg was kept and spoke to it." Rail felt the air go out of the room. "My father," he said. He had large hands, it said. "I know the feeling of them against the shell." He had a way of speaking where his voice was lower at the end of a sentence than at the beginning. He came often. He said your name more than any other word. Rail said nothing. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth and said nothing. He also said a phrase. It continued. He said it the way someone says something they have said so many times it has worn a groove. He said, "You look for the bent one in a pile of straight ones. That is always the real find." The room was very quiet. That phrase had existed between two people in the world, Donner and his son. It was not written anywhere. It was not recorded. It was something his father had said to him on his first salvage run at age 12, standing in a cargo bay on a rusted hauler, and Rail had never repeated it to another living person. "I need a name," the creature said, giving him the mercy of a change in subject. "I have one that feels correct." "Draven." "Draven," Rail said. His voice was rough. "Yes. It was also in the egg. I think it was chosen." Rail stood up slowly. He went to the window and looked out at the flat, dusty land and the far edge of the canyon. He stood there for a while. Draven did not fill the silence with anything. It simply waited, which was more than most people could do. "How much else did the egg keep?" Rail asked, not turning around. Draven was quiet for just a moment too long. "Enough," it said. Rail closed his eyes. He had been afraid of the wrong things for 3 years. He was beginning to understand that the right thing to be afraid of had been inside him the whole time, not outside. A secret did not stay still. It grew weight the longer it was carried. He turned around. Draven sat in a bar of morning light from the window, silver and gold, perfectly still, watching him with amber eyes. "We'll talk," Rail said. "But not yet." "I will wait," Draven said. It seemed to mean more than the words. A week passed the way weeks do when something impossible has become ordinary, slowly at first, then all at once. Draven grew, not in a way that suggested a medical problem or something to worry about, just steadily, visibly, the way a well-watered plant grows when the conditions are right. By day 4, the creature was the size of a medium dog. By day 7, it needed more floor space than the back room allowed, and Rail quietly relocated its sleeping arrangement to the larger area near the front of the homestead where he kept equipment he rarely used. They fell into a rhythm. Draven asked questions about everything, but especially about objects. What does this tool do? Why is that panel sealed? What is the liquid in the blue container? Why is there a lock on the second drawer, but not the first? Rail answered most of them. He found it easier than he expected. There was something settling about explaining ordinary things to someone who received them without any of the assumed context that made human conversation slippery. On the 8th day, Draven said, "Your father did not die in a hull breach." Rail was at the workbench. He did not drop the tool in his hand. He set it down with care, which was worse somehow, because it meant his body had already known this moment was coming. "What did the egg hold?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Not details," Draven said. "But there are shapes to things. A person's grief has a shape. The thing you carry has a specific shape. It is not the shape of losing someone to an accident. It is the shape of losing someone and knowing something that makes the loss worse, and not being able to use that knowledge." Rail turned around. Draven sat in the middle of the floor, watching him steadily. "You have been carrying it for 2 years and 11 months, Draven said. "The egg measured time differently, but that is my estimate from what was absorbed." Rail pulled out the chair from the workbench and sat in it backwards, arms folded over the back. He looked at Draven for a while. Outside, wind moved along the side of the homestead with a low sound like something being drawn across fabric. "If I tell you," Rail said carefully, "it goes nowhere." "I do not have anywhere for it to go," Draven said. That was fair enough. Rail told it. The night his father died, Rail had been running a monitoring tap on a salvage frequency. His father had locked him off the Calostar's main channel 2 weeks earlier, which was unusual enough on its own. Niradonner did not lock his son out of things without reason. So Rail had rigged a passive tap on a secondary frequency, the kind of quiet workaround his father had actually taught him years ago for exactly these kinds of situations. He had not been doing it to interfere. He had been doing it because he was worried, and because worry without information is intolerable. He heard the detonation order on that channel before the blast. It was not a warning. It was not an error. Someone spoke 2 words in clear colonial standard, "Clear it," and less than 30 seconds later, the Calostar's transponder went silent. The voice had belonged to Governor Solta. Rail knew the voice. He had heard it at colony events, at his father's commendations, at the speeches given when Niradonner was being called a hero in front of crowds that did not know what the man had actually found on that last salvage run. Rail had no recording. The tap was passive and not archived. He had no witness. He had only a memory and a dead father, and a governor who wore the grief of the Calostar incident as a personal tragedy whenever it was politically useful. "So I buried it," Rail said. "Along with him." Draven was quiet for a moment. "You were afraid," Draven said. "Not a judgment, just a naming of a fact. I had no proof. Solta has colonial security, a legal office, and 3 decades of political cover. I had a memory of a voice on a channel I was not supposed to be monitoring. That is still more than nothing. That is approximately nothing," Rail said, "when the person on the other side has everything else." Draven shifted its weight, scales catching the light. "Then the question is not whether you had enough to act then. The question is whether something has changed." Rail looked at it. "You have me now," Draven said. "I do not know exactly what that means yet, but I know the egg was placed in that grave deliberately, by hands that were careful, by someone who expected you to find it. That means something was expected to change." Rail stood up and walked to the window. He had done this a lot lately, standing at windows looking at dust and distance. "I need you to stay inside," he said, "away from the windows. Patrol drones do weekly sweeps, and I do not know what they are programmed to flag." "I understand," Draven said. "I am not doing nothing," Rail said, and it was important to him to say it out loud. "I just need to do it right. I need it to be something that sticks." Draven said nothing, but when Rail turned around, the amber eyes held something that looked, if he was reading it correctly, like patience. He went to the locked second drawer, opened it. Inside was a personal recorder, a hard copy of the frequency log from that night. Incomplete, but real, and a name he had written on a slip of paper 3 years ago and not looked at since. He looked at it now. "Solta." He put it back. but he left the drawer unlocked. The night before everything changed, Rail did not sleep. He sat at the workbench for 6 hours doing quiet, careful work. He copied the frequency log fragment onto 3 separate data chips. He wrote up a plain, factual account of what he had heard the night the Callow star went silent. Dates, times, the exact words spoken, the voice he had recognized. He did not write it like a man seeking revenge. He wrote it like a salvager logging a find, precisely, without extra words. Then he uploaded all of it to 3 separate off-world archive services, the kind that charged a small annual fee and asked no questions, and kept copies automatically in rotating cold storage. He created a lock on the files. A simple one. If he did not send a renewal signal every 14 days, the files became publicly visible. He set up the first renewal signal to go out in the morning. Then he went to the kitchen and made something to eat, and sat with Draven and did not explain any of it. Draven did not ask, which told Rail that it already understood the shape of what he was doing, even without the details. In the morning, a colonial patrol drone flew the standard sweep over the eastern homestead grid. Rail watched it from the window. Draven was in the large front room, in the space between 2 equipment crates. Rail had moved the crates himself, carefully, to block the sight lines from the eastern windows. He had done this 4 days ago. He had not said why at the time. The drone passed. Rail exhaled. Then the drone turned back. It hovered for 11 seconds over the front of the homestead, long enough to get a clear image. Then it moved on. Rail stood at the window with his coffee getting cold in his hand. 4 hours later, First Warden Doss arrived with 6 colonial security personnel in 2 vehicles. Doss was a large man who moved like someone who had given up on speed in favor of inevitability. He had a flat, careful face and did not talk more than he needed to. Rail had met him twice at colony functions and found him approximately honest, which in the context of Solta's administration was notable. Doss stepped out of the first vehicle holding a paper containment order, physical paper, which meant this had been prepared in advance, before the drone even landed. Rail walked outside. He stood on the front step with his arms at his sides. Doss began to read the containment order aloud. Something about unregistered biological entities and colonial safety protocols. Rail listened politely and said nothing. Then the front door of the homestead opened behind him. Draven stepped out. Draven was now the size of a horse, and silver and gold in the morning light in a way that made the 6 security personnel stop doing what they were doing and simply look. Not with aggression. With the kind of involuntary attention that beautiful and impossible things demand. Doss stopped reading. Draven walked to stand beside Rail and looked at Doss with amber eyes. Governor Solta, Draven said, in a clear voice that carried easily across the open yard, ordered the destruction of the salvage vessel Callow Star. He spoke 2 words on a secondary frequency before the vessel was destroyed. Rail Donner heard those words. He has carried this knowledge for nearly 3 years without telling anyone, because he had no proof and no protection. He was correct to be afraid. He is less afraid now. Total silence. One of the security personnel dropped something. The sound of it hitting the ground was very loud. Doss looked at Rail. His expression did not change much, but something shifted behind it. A small recalibration, like a man quietly reorganizing his priorities. Rail spoke before Doss could find words. "You can detain us if you want," he said. His voice was steady. He had not planned the exact words, but the shape of the statement had been in him for a while. The frequency log and a full written account are already stored in 3 off-world archives. Locked files. If I do not send a renewal every 2 weeks, they go public automatically. If something happens to me or to Draven before I do, same result, earlier. So the question you actually need to answer is not what is in the containment order. The question is what Solta told you this morning and whether you want to be the name attached to whatever comes next. Doss looked at him for a long time. Then Doss looked at Draven. Draven looked back, patient, unblinking. "Stand down," Doss said to his people. Quietly, without drama. One of them started to object. Doss turned and looked at them with the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in discussion, and they did not finish the objection. Doss turned back to Rail. "You should have reported it 3 years ago." "Yes," Rail said. "I know." Doss looked at him for another moment. "I would like to speak with you privately. Not today. Tomorrow. Without a containment order." I am available, Rail said. Doss got back in his vehicle. His people followed. They drove away without further words, and the dust their vehicles raised moved away down the road and slowly settled. Rail stood in the yard for a while, without moving. Draven sat beside him. Neither of them said anything. Somewhere to the east, the colony was already talking. News on Kareth 9 traveled the way news traveled everywhere. Faster than anyone expected, slower than anyone wanted, and never exactly the shape it started as. By evening, every person in the colony would know that something had happened at the Donner homestead. By morning, they would have a version of what it was. Rel did not know yet if that was good or bad. But the drawer was unlocked. The files were uploaded. The secret was out of his chest and into the world, and the world had not ended. That was a start. 2 days after Doss drove away from the homestead, a ship appeared in orbit above Kareth 9 that did not match any registered vessel in the colony's traffic system. It was not large. It was shaped in a way that did not look designed so much as grown. Surfaces that curved without hard edges, a hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The colony traffic officer sent 3 standard identification requests. On the third, a response came back in a very old form of colonial standard, polite and precise and absolutely clear about one thing. The vessel was coming down regardless of whether clearance was granted. It landed in the open ground north of the colony center. Not at the dock, not at the designated landing area. In the open ground, where it would be seen. From it came one creature. It was old in the way that mountains are old, not in visible age, but in weight. Silver-scaled like Draven, but larger, much larger, with wings folded close and tight, and a deliberate quality to every step that suggested someone who had stopped moving quickly centuries ago and had no need to start again. Its eyes were amber, darker than Draven's. It carried nothing and wore nothing and seemed to need neither. It spoke to the colony administrator who met it at the edge of the landing ground and asked, without any introduction, to be taken to the egg. Rail was notified. He drove to the colony center with Draven in the back of his vehicle, which required Draven to fold itself into an uncomfortable shape, but Draven did not complain. They arrived at the same time as the creature from the ship, which made the subsequent meeting happen in the open ground near the colony's water processing building, which was not dignified but was at least open enough for all parties to breathe. The old creature looked at Draven for a long time. Then it said, in measured colonial standard, "The egg was taken from a breeding vault on our home world 41 years ago. We lost its location. We assumed it was destroyed." "It was not," Draven said. Clearly, the old creature shifted its attention briefly to Rail, then back to Draven. "You will return with me." "No," Draven said. The silence after that word was the kind of silence that had texture. "You do not understand what you are," the old creature said. Not unkindly. More the way a person speaks to someone who has grown up without access to their own history. The old creature was quiet for a moment. "Our eggs do not work that way." This one did. Another silence. Rail stood slightly to the side and said nothing. This was not his conversation to join. He had learned in the last 2 weeks that some things resolved better when he simply remained present and let events move at their own speed. Draven spoke again. "The egg was placed in that grave deliberately by a man named Nira Donner, who found it during a salvage run and understood what he had. He did not sell it. He did not report it. He kept it for years, speaking to it. And when he understood that he was going to die, and he did understand, I think, because the egg knew the shape of a man who has accepted something, he buried it where his son would return to, regularly, reliably, alone." Rail's throat tightened. He kept his expression even. "He chose the location," Draven continued, "because grief is a sustained and deep emotion and eggs absorb what surrounds them over time. He chose it because his son would come back there every year carrying the weight of an injustice that needed to be corrected. He wanted what hatched to understand both of those things. Failure, and the choice to correct it." The old creature looked at Rail now. Really looked, the way the dragon from the ship seemed to look at things, not at the surface but at the shape underneath. "Your father planned this," it said. "It appears so," Rail said. "He was a salvager." "He was," Rail said. "He had a saying. You look for the bent one in a pile of straight ones. That is always the real find." The old creature turned this over in silence for a while. "What Draven has become," it said finally, is not what our vaults produce. What did your vaults produce? Rail asked. Strength. Loyalty to the Conclave. Purpose. It paused. Those are not small things. No, Rail agreed. But they are not the only things. The old creature looked at Draven again. You refuse to come. I refuse to come yet, Draven said. There is work here that is unfinished. When it is finished, I will come and see what you have and decide what I want from it. That is the offer. You would negotiate with the Conclave. I would, Draven said. I learned that from someone who spent 3 years being afraid to negotiate, and then did it anyway. It turns out the skill is not the difficult part. The difficult part is deciding to start. Rail looked at the ground briefly. He was not going to be embarrassed by a dragon in front of an alien dignitary. He was mostly succeeding. The old creature breathed out slowly. I will wait, it said. Not indefinitely, but I will witness what you intend to finish here. The Conclave does not break witness. I know, Draven said. That is why I asked. It had not asked out loud, but the old creature seemed to accept this as sufficient. It turned and walked back toward its ship without further ceremony. Draven watched it go. Rail stood beside it in the afternoon dust and did not say anything for a while. My father spoke to an egg for years, he said eventually. Yes. And that is the reason I am still alive and Solta is about to be removed from office. In part, Draven said. Rail nodded slowly. He really was an honest man. He was, Draven said, even when it cost him. They stood there a while longer. The Conclave ship reflected the sky and said nothing, which was a thing it turned out ships and grief had in common. The colony hall had not been this full in years. People stood along the back walls and out through the side doors. Not because they had been told to come, no official summons had gone out. They came because word travels on a small colony world the way water finds low ground. And by the morning of the proceeding, every person on Kareth 9 had heard enough of the shape of things to understand that what was happening in that hall would determine what kind of place they lived in. Solta sat at the front table with 2 advisors and a legal officer. He looked composed. He had the practiced composure of a man who had survived difficult moments before by controlling the room. He wore the same expression he wore at commendation ceremonies. Measured grief, steady leadership. Rail sat across from him at the other table, alone except for a single data pad on the surface in front of him. Draven was outside. The hall was not built for something of Draven's current size. But the windows were open, and Draven had positioned itself along the outside wall in a way that was visible to everyone inside who cared to look. Which was everyone. The colonial adjudicator opened the proceeding and asked Rail to speak. Rail did not stand. He sat the way he sat at his workbench, still and direct, without performance. He stated what he had heard. The date, the time, the frequency channel he had been monitoring, the exact words that had been spoken before the Kalos star's transponder went dark. He said the voice had been Governor Solta's. He said he had recognized it clearly and had no doubt. He said he had not reported it at the time because he had no proof and no recording, and the person he was accusing had the full weight of colonial authority behind him. He said he understood that this had been the wrong choice and that he was not looking for sympathy about it. He was correcting it now. Then he slid the data pad across the table toward the adjudicator. On it was a recording, not of the frequency channel, which he had never been able to recover. Something better. 3 weeks before the Kalos star was destroyed, Das had been present at a meeting in Solta's administrative office. Das, it turned out, had his own concerns about the Kalos star operation, a different salvage issue, unrelated to Rail's father at the time, but enough to make him careful. He had kept a private log. He had never used it because the same calculation Rail had made applied to him. No proof sufficient to survive what Solta could bring against it. Until now. Solta's legal officer objected to the recording. The adjudicator looked at the legal officer with the expression of someone who had been on Kareth 9 for 30 years and was tired of certain kinds of nonsense, and overruled the objection. Solta made one attempt. He turned toward the hall and addressed the people standing at the back, the settlers, the workers, the families who had been on this world longer than his administration. And he spoke about stability and service and the cost of disruption. He spoke the way he always spoke, and some of it was even true, in the narrow way that made his kind of dishonesty difficult to fight. Then Draven spoke from outside the window. Not loudly, not with anger, just clearly, the way it always spoke. You are describing yourself as necessary, Draven said. People who cause harm often do. Necessary people do not order ships destroyed to protect cargo manifests. They do not spend 3 years standing at memorials for a man they killed. The hall was very quiet. Solta turned toward the window. He looked at Draven with the particular expression of a man encountering something that does not fit into any category he prepared for. He said nothing. For the first time in the proceeding, he had nothing to say. The adjudicator suspended Solta from office, pending formal investigation by an off-world authority. Colonial Security, now under DOS, who had submitted the recording himself that morning, took custody of Solta without incident and without drama. It was over in 2 hours. Afterward, people came up to Rail in the way people do when something significant has just happened, with words that were less about the words and more about the act of being present. He thanked them all and meant it, and was grateful when they eventually moved on. The Conclave delegate found him at the edge of the hall, near one of the open side doors, when the crowd had thinned. I witnessed, it said. Thank you, Rail said. The egg was missing for 41 years, it said. In that time, our vaults produced many fine creatures. Strong, disciplined, loyal. It paused. None of them have done what Draven did in this room today. None of them would have known how. Rail considered that. It spoke the truth to people who needed to hear it. That is not complicated. It is more complicated than it appears, the delegate said. Truth is easy to speak when there is no cost. What Draven did required understanding the specific weight of a specific silence in a specific room and knowing exactly when the room was ready to receive it. That is not strength. That is something else. Rail looked through the door at Draven, who was sitting in the open space outside the hall with the late afternoon sun on its scales, watching the people who passed, and occasionally being watched back. I do not know what to call it, Rail said. Neither do we, the delegate said. That is why I am still here. They stood together in the doorway for a moment in the companionable way of two people who do not have more to say, but are not yet ready to separate. Later, as the sun dropped behind the canyon ridge, Rail drove out to his father's grave. Draven walked beside the vehicle because there was no longer any pretending that it fit inside. The canyon was cool, and the light was orange and flat, and the grave marker stood in it exactly as it always had. Rail cleared the debris from the base of the marker with his hands. Dead scrub, small stones. He worked until the base was clean. Then he stood up and read the words he had carved himself. Near a donor, salvager, honest man. He did not change them. They were right. Draven sat behind him, large and silver and quiet. Some silences are the heavy kind, full of things unsaid and weight that has nowhere to go. Rail had carried that kind for 3 years. He knew the difference now. This silence was the other kind. He let it be.